welcome to Getting the Answers, episode 17. I'm your host, Wyatt Birkenhoff, or The Breakdown with WB, and I'm joined today with my co host and very sharply dressed. And
Yeah, I'm
yeah.
I'm Anwiltus, and welcome to the show, our beautiful audience. It's always a great time to have us with you and us together, getting the answers.
Yes. And today's episode, I should say, is going to be a interesting one, I think, for sure. Especially since if you watched our last week's one about culture, it's a similar kind of philosophical, but potentially political conversation once again, compared to just all politics of episodes we've done before and whatnot. But today's episode is, does society need religion? So I thought before we got into all of like the our conversation, our debate, or whatever this might turn into, I thought I would define what religion is. So according to Webster, and anybody that's gone on Webster dictionaries knows that they usually have multiple kind of like definitions for a word. Compared to like if you just search religion on Google, you'll get like your first result that's just the one definition. But I wanted to pick apart two of them because one of them is I think what typically people think when they think of religion, and that is the service or worship of a god or a supernatural. So especially modern religion, Christianity, yeah, modern religions, this is kind of what we think about. They go into church or they go into mass and they worship their God every Sunday. And if you're a good Christian, you may pray a couple times a week, and or every day if you're really good. And that's I think what typically people think about for religion. But there's also a interesting definition I think as well. And that definition is a cause or principle or a system of beliefs held to with ardor and faith. So that's kind of another definition that I think leads to a more potential debate on what exactly religion is compared to like what you typically think of it as.
Yes, indeed, and I would say that the question on what exactly a religion is, in my opinion, is an important question and a question that is significant enough to warrant an answer. And in my opinion, I would agree that the second position, certainly in the Merriam Webster dictionary that you brought up, uh, certainly has an increased scope because I think that simply limiting it to the belief in God or the supernatural is, while it's useful in some sense, it also excludes other religions that don't necessarily make those kinds of claims. So, in my opinion, the most inclusive definition and a definition that really gets to the root of the issue would be the adherence to metaphysical principles. And that allows you to take that in any direction while also having the idea of it's an adherence to these principles, which has the practical side of religion included, which is very important, and also by making it an adherence to metaphysical principles. While that can mean a supernatural idea, it does not necessarily mean a supernatural idea, and also includes religions that do not posit types of internationalism, sorry, not internationalism, supernaturalism or theism. So I think that that's an inclusive definition that really works with all the different ways that people like to categorize religion. Now, of course, the flip side of that is that under an idea, if you take it to be metaphysical principles, then anybody that makes metaphysical claims and adheres to them is, in theory, operating on some sort of religion, which means, under this idea, atheism is a religion, which some people might agree with, some people might disagree with, but of course, there's different types of atheists, and they have different types of metaphysical claims, and so there's different ways to view religion on that, but it all depends on the context in which you are discussing religion and what you consider to be a religious or an irreligious action.
Yes, definitely. It's interesting you brought up the fact of atheism because that was a point that I had as well. Because a lot of people, especially more like Christian households, will argue. They're like, well, you believing that there's not a God is a religion. I hear that occasionally. And at first I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. But I remember I looked at the definitions. This is like years ago now, and I'm like, well, I mean, under this definition, I mean, it kind of could make sense, especially because if you start arguing with a lot of like atheists that are passionate about it, you start to hear like the same answers. So that's kind of like their set of beliefs in a large way. But
yeah, which isn't to say that atheism is considered a formal or organized religion, but rather that by making metaphysical claims or engaging with metaphysical claims, it in itself has a contrast to things that we certainly do view as religion. And in that contrast, we consider it an opposing religion to that religion in the contrast sense.
yes, right. And there's nothing in the definition that says it has to be organized by any means. uh, yeah. One of the interesting things when thinking about the question, at least when I was thinking about it, was I was like, okay, so when was like the first evidence of a religion in a society? Was kind of the one of the questions I had, and most of what came up was about 13th century was the first like known religion that historians are able to verify, I guess you could say.
BC?
Mm-hmm. 13th century. Let me make sure I get the exact date. I don't want to mess that up.
Or are you simply referring to the usage of the term religion?
The usage of the term religion, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
There was religions before that, for sure.
Because I'm aware of the interaction with cultures that have a concept of religion and cultures that don't have a concept of religion in the sense that there's different religions.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, when Commodore Matthew Perry went to Japan and they were trying to persuade Japan to be tolerant of Christians so that it would allow them to conduct trade and do various things. The Japanese at that time, while they certainly understood certain ideas about what a religion is, they didn't have a word in their language to describe the idea of religion in a larger context. And so I think it's very useful to understand that the way words are used can develop people's understanding of what a religion is. And that being said, that doesn't mean that the Japanese didn't have religion before that, because they certainly did. It's just that they didn't have a a context for a linguistic context for the idea of a religion in general, as abstracted from actual religious practices.
Right. Yep. Definitely. That makes a lot of sense in a way, because I mean, obviously words change over time, meanings, and sometimes new words get made, and older words just end up not being used anymore. That happens a lot. And the fact that the fact that no religion existed till the word religion existed is obviously not going to be true. But I thought that was interesting that that was like the first usage of the term per se.
Yeah, and that's certainly 80. Then I would estimate, but yes, religion as a term is necessarily an abstraction because it does not refer to something that is specific in the world, but rather becomes a category describing various things. And your definition of religion will then determine what you include or exclude from that intellectual category.
Right. Mm-mm. So I'm trying to think of how to best word this question, but I think I'll say it this way. I think in order to really get to the heart of the question, I think we also need to ask, why do people want to have a religion, or why are people a part of a religion, or you could even just say, why does religion simply exist? Because I do think they kind of lead to the same answer, but you may have different answers with those questions. But in simple terms, why do people want religion? Because you've seen it in society and in history for a very long time.
Yeah. And that's actually a complex question. And of
Yes,
course,
very
it
complex.
depends on your definition of religion. Because if you consider the idea of religion to be simply adherence to metaphysical concepts, as I have described, then therefore religion becomes a necessary outcome of thought processes, and therefore everyone has religion, uh, whether they are organized or disorganized with it. And so, under that idea, religion always exists in a sense, and necessarily exists the moment you take into yourself a deeper idea of why are things happening, uh, what is the relationship between cause and effect, what is right and wrong, um, how do we know things, and if we understand religion uh, as metaphysical principles and the results of those principles, then necessarily everyone becomes religious. However, if we understand it as being something more specific to supernaturalism, then the question of why people are religious can go into a different question, into a different area, because for someone who is not religious, it would necessarily have to be a social construct of some kind, something that was constructed because the supernatural would not exist. However, for someone who is religious, the adherence to the belief in supernatural events necessarily is rooted in the idea of supernatural evidences. And in Christianity, for example, that would be miracles, it would be the incarnation of Jesus, resurrection, the revelation of the scriptures by God, etc. And that would be supernatural events that mean that religion does not come internally from the person, or from his interaction with the world, but rather is something that comes from supernatural interference in the world, and that produces religion in that sense. There's also the idea of natural events or artificial events being misinterpreted as supernatural, which is the idea that, let's say, ancient aliens theorists propose. So, on a supernatural basis of religion, that would be what it is defined as. But if you consider religion as rather than supernatural, but as practices, particular religious practices people have, then you can take a similar approach in understanding how were these practices developed historically, anthropologically, sociologically. Why do people do these things? Where do they come from? And how does that develop? And is there a higher origin to it, or is it something that people just did, uh, partially maybe because of instinct or because of their interaction with the environment, human interaction with other humans? Um, so that's another way to put it. But if you then consider religion as a set of beliefs and stories, then you take perhaps a more cultural outlook on it as perhaps being an exaggerated account of ancient oral histories or of other things. But I would say that another approach is a biological approach that some people have. Some people are of the opinion that human brains are hardwired, so to say, to be religious, and that therefore irreligion is an active working against the natural biology of humans. And so there's all these different positions. Now, on the position that I would say, as I put the definition of metaphysical principles, everybody is religious to some extent. The question then becomes, are you consciously religious, and are you consciously trying to have a coherent viewpoint, or are you simply operating unconsciously of the metaphysical principles that you are automatically assuming as you operate in the world?
Right. Yes. Uh, it's just a very tough question, and that's why I wanted to make sure I gave you time to answer the way you wanted to before I would ask more like specific questions off of it. But I do think what you said is very good about addressing the two definitions I talked about earlier. Because when I think back in history, in high school or whatever, you would talk about the Mayans or Incans and cultures like that worshipped more supernatural than, say, like what we think of now, like how Christians worship, God. They worship like the sun god, for example. And in a large part, at least what the history teacher said, or what historians believe, is the factor that they did that because they were wanting to make sure, their crops grew. It was more motives like that. And that's kind of why they thought they needed to worship, the rain god or the sun god, things like that. So it seemed to be like it was out of self interest a little bit, and that's why it was more like supernatural, but still a religion, you could argue, on that second definition. And then to address like the first question, and I call it kind of like the modern definition because it's more like what Christianity is, and well, modern religions. Anyway, is the factor of I guess to put it this way, I think a lot of times to the why people need religion now that fits more the first definition is a lot out of habits. I would say. I think a lot of people like to have habits when going to church because one of the reasons why I say that is the Catholic Church used to just be in Latin, and the majority of the population didn't know Latin, yet they still showed up to mass. So it's a lot out of tradition in that way, I think, because it's that's a whole separate question I think you could have too on why they would do that if they didn't understand what was being said or seen or anything like that. But it is a tough question to answer, I would say. Uh, but I do think it comes down to needs. I do think people feel like through religion, through worshiping their god or their supernatural beings or whatever you want to call it. I think it ultimately comes down to they feel better about it, and they think it may give them some sort of value in return.
Yes, I do agree that there are some people that do think of it in that way.
Mm-hmm.
However, when we ask the question, does society need religion, or does society uh, need a religion, or should society be religious? When we ask these questions, a lot of people will bring up ideas specifically of personal or social benefit in society from certain religions. And they'll talk about unity, they'll talk about prosperity, they'll talk about various ideas. Um, for example, when people talk about Western civilization, some people like to attribute a lot of the success of Western civilization to the spread of Christianity among the Western civilizations. But I think that a mindset that takes that as the priority is a mindset that ultimately is inverted from the religious mindset. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that when you take religion as necessary because it's beneficial to society, you ultimately take religion and you invert the priorities that the religious people have in and what I mean by that is when you have a religious person, let's say a Christian believes in the truth of God's word, in the resurrection eventually, in God having a plan of salvation for his people who are the Christians. And you take that and you ask them, what is more important? Is it more important that they obey God in what he commands them, or that their religion benefits society? And the answer of someone that I would say is consistent logically, internally, with their religion, they would say that obeying God would be more important than the prosperity of their earthly society. And I think that that is a religious attitude because in doing so they would actually be obedient and adherent to the metaphysical principles underlying their faith rather than to the external principles that outsiders would place as questions of the usefulness of their faith to general society. So I would say that an internal theological comparison would therefore be the idea of the so-called prosperity gospel that some preachers are known of preaching. And this is an idea that being a faithful Christian gains you financial success and success in your career, success in getting paid more, perhaps having a nicer home, a nicer car. And you do that by being a virtuous Christian, and by donating a lot of money to your local church, of course, as the preachers say.
Yes.
And the problem with that is that it's not historically accurate to Christianity, and it is, in my view, an anachronism, because the earliest Christians in the Roman Empire, frequently, when they converted to Christianity, they would essentially suffer a disruption from various social institutions because of their newfound faith. They were no longer able to interact with certain elements of society and take part in social life in the same way, and in some cases suffered persecution and had a great loss through their conversion. And this is still true in some societies that are outside of the West, and among missionaries that go to those societies that, through great expenditure, go there with the hope that maybe someone will hear the gospel. So in that sense, I would say the idea that Christianity is beneficial in an political and economic sense, in my view, is similar to the idea of the prosperity gospel, in that while it can be said that Jesus certainly did say a lot about money management, and that there can be a correlation with various things, to take that and to equate that also allows the contrapositive and the negation to enter into play. That is to say that if we say the economy of a Christian country is good because Christianity is good, then could we also say, hypothetically speaking, in a case where the economy of a Christian country is bad, that therefore Christianity is also bad? And therefore, by linking the two concepts, it creates an instability externally, because it sort of places a requirement and a focus on religion that the religion itself does not have, and internally, because under the idea of what you convert someone with is what you convert that person to, and therefore it creates a situation where a lot of people are simply Christian because of economic and political pressures, and once those pressures disappear, then their faith is that shallow and they disappear from the church. So in that sense, this applies to every religion as well. I'm just using Christianity because it's a familiar example.
For most people, yeah, or everybody who's listening to this probably. I would say that. Oh no, go on.
Yeah. So in that sense, what I'm saying is that to say that a religion is important for a society purely because of its benefit to the people in that society is, in my view, undermining the internal logic of religiosity.
Yes, and I'm glad you brought that up, because there's a big difference between people who are, I would call it, true believers, and people that kind of like phone it in, I guess you could say. And I'm just going to use my experience as an example, right? So my family just recently converted, I guess you could call it, to be Catholic. And so they have masses, especially during like Holy Week. There's like several masses before the actual, Sunday mass, or for when, the whole Easter story. I think everybody knows that. So there's a thing that a lot of like Catholics say where people only show up for Easter and Christmas, and what's the other one now? There's three masses that are important. Anyway, they'll show up to like three masses out of the whole year, and that's just, and they still call themselves Christian on census, or call themselves Catholic on census, or things like that. And those are, and I'm not trying to necessarily say that they may be bad. They could potentially have jobs, and they could actually be extremely, faithful in their personal lives and not public from when you like see them at mass, right? Who knows what's going on in their life? So I want to make that clear as well. But there's a big difference between Christians that simply show up for important church services or important masses just to say that they went and don't really do anything outside of that, to people who actually truly believe in their religion. And for Christianity, I think it's extremely important, because the people who truly believe in Christianity believe that the life here on earth is extremely short, because ultimately they want eternal life, and eternal life is internal. It's extremely long. So you know how you have like the whole timeline on, this is when the earth was made, this is when the first organism was made. You have your whole timeline, and the amount on that timeline where the earth was created is like extremely small compared to everything else. It may be the universe timeline I'm thinking about, but you get the concept. It's kind of the same thing for Christianity in a large part, for people that truly believe in Christianity.
Yes. So to make that clear, for Christianity, the benefits in society are an unnecessary side benefit that are not viewed as part of the ultimate long-term priorities.
Right, definitely.
And I would say the same is true in a lot of other religions, where obviously most religious people believe that there should be virtue in a society, that there should be benefits to the people in a society, but ultimately, when you get down to the actual priorities of the religion, it's not, for most religions, it's not humanistic. That is to say, it's not purely on the benefit to the people in society, but it's a greater purpose. And if the prosperity of society and the greater purpose conflict, then you end up in a situation where you have to sacrifice the prosperity of society for the greater purpose, logically speaking, that is. And in that sense, to say that religion is necessary for society, in my view, is a backwards approach, because society instead, on a religious viewpoint, becomes accessory to religion rather than religion being accessory to society.
Mm-hmm. That is a good way of thinking about that, actually. I just want to say a few things about the prosperity thing, even though I don't necessarily want to get too sidetracked on that in particular with what I'm going to say, because it's not super important. But one of the people that comes to mind, well, two people, and ironically they're both in Texas, so go Texas. In a bad way, this one. But you have Kenneth Copeland and you have Joel Osteen. And the reason I bring these two up is one of them, I think, is taking the Bible, if you could say that, and taking the prosperity message in a way that's almost completely opposite of what is there. And then you have one that I think is a little bit more subtle about it, and somebody who I think is actually believes in prosperity. Like, I think he actually does. One of them, I think, is just taking advantage of it. And Kenneth Copeland, I think, is the one that is pretty much making the Bible and twisting it into his own version of the Bible, and that's all what he's doing. And it is prosperity gospel has grounds of why I could see people wanting it, but as you said very well, it's almost grounds in people who have selfish motives for how they view Christianity. Because I think we said this very well so far. Uh, for Christianity, the purpose is God, and not so much the purpose being you. And I think the prosperity gospel very much focuses on you and trying to get better in life through money, essentially.
Yeah. And that's not to say that there aren't humanist movements, that there aren't movements that do consider the well-being of humanity to be the primary motivator. However, these only operate that way through their understanding of the importance of humanity rather than taking that as previous to their examination, metaphysically speaking. That is to say that for people to look at something physically and understand something that is physical, people have to establish categories and epistemology and axiology and metaphysics in order to fully examine that. And therefore, and this usually in many cases happens unconsciously. That is to say, people have prepositions about various things, and they operate on them unconsciously, and then they might think about them afterwards. But even if you think about the prepositions afterwards, they still exist when you are making the decision based on them beforehand.
Mm-hmm. But yeah.
So in that sense, the metaphysical principles will always logically come before their physical application, logically speaking.
Yes, definitely. Like the idea that giving church your money, and in some cases, a large percentage of your money, because mostly prosperity gospel tends to target poor communities and communities that are more desperate to needing money. Because once again, I do think it's a very selfish way of viewing Christianity. So I also want to throw that out as well. I forget exactly where I was going with that, but I think that, oh yeah, I remember now. The idea that you're gonna give, however much money to the church, and the church takes your money, and you're gonna get something back in return, is a very odd way of viewing, how viewing Christianity and viewing what your religion is. But I think we spent enough time on prosperity gospel, but I do think it does have good examples for modern Christianity, because I can just kind of see it in my life and people who I interact with. I do think a lot of people view Christianity in that way, and that's why I brought it up earlier. But yeah, I guess to answer the question, does society need religion? One thing that came to my mind with this question was, and you kind of talked about it a little bit, but the idea being, if I'll put it this way: if religion ceased to exist and we were to be created again or whatever today, and we're like the first humans on Earth right now, would a religion be made, or something similar, a belief or whatever you want to call it, be made?
Yes, that is an interesting question. And so, under the premise that we are new humans with no past culture that exist in an unexplained world that do not have any access to any supernatural revelation.
Right.
Under that premise, it is really a question of how you understand the nature of humans and how you would expect society to evolve. So, some people, as I had said, believe that religion is natural to humans. They might believe it to be natural biologically, they might believe it to be natural spiritually, even. That there's a spiritual understanding, a spiritual component to humans that has a propensity for understanding spiritual matters in that sense. And so therefore anthropologically, people holding either the physical or the spiritual perspective on that would say that religion is inevitable unless humans are fundamentally changed in some way. Now, if you take the definition that I put out, that religion is the adherence to metaphysical principles, inevitably people will develop metaphysics, even if they are simply the prepositions that they unconsciously use to interact with their environments. And therefore, religion is also inevitable in that sense. Now, does that mean that people would have an idea of the supernatural? Maybe, maybe not. They could, they might not. Would they develop rituals? Maybe, maybe not. There's also the idea that through their interaction with the natural world, they might interpret natural events to be supernatural events, events that are random to be events that have agency behind them, and therefore they would develop religion. But I would say that generally speaking, the development of religion seems to me to be more likely than not having a development of religion. That is a conscious development of religion. If we go on under my definition, where it is possible to develop religion unconsciously, uh, but we're talking about conscious religion, conscious beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, I do think that it is highly likely that they would develop.
I would tend to agree. I don't necessarily think that it would be super fast, like within something like that, because religions or beliefs like that tend to take time to form. So I don't think it necessarily would be like a super fast type of thing. But I think ultimately that society would have a religion at some point, because I think that it will lead to that way, because if you think of it as like the Mayans or Incans, where they had their sun gods and rain gods, that seems to make a lot of sense, because that is what they valued because of their crops or whatever you want to say, and they probably had at some point a experience with it that may have led them to believe that that power being the sun or that power being the rain was supernatural and not just a random thing that happened. So I think I pretty much agree with what you said, and the fact that I do think a religion would be made at some point in that new society.
Now, on the question of do we need a formal singular religion to operate in a society, that's a more complex question. And once again, you end up looking into anthropology, and it also brings forward the question of true and false religions. That is to say, that the metaphysical principles of various religions, whether they are true and accurate to reality or whether they are false and inaccurate to reality, will determine what your answer to that question is. So under let's say a Calvinistic perspective of religion, you would have a position where there is a true religion, but you can't get everybody. You don't have a surefire way to get everybody on board with that true religion, and therefore the idea of religious unity in a society is a bit difficult. You can still make laws based on ultimate metaphysical truths, but the extent to which you can unify a society religiously is limited by anthropological elements. Now, under other ideas, it is possible to have society to be fully unified religiously or irreligiously, and then that's not a problem. But it really depends on what a human is and what the interaction between humans and religions are, and what is a true and an untrue religion.
Right. And that brings me to a question that I was thinking about before that I think leads into this pretty well. Oftentimes I'll hear, like, if you're not religious through like a Christianity or whatever, or you're not really necessarily atheist, or maybe you are atheist, but just to make the question simple, if you don't necessarily believe in anything, you're still worshiping something, or you're still worshiping something. It may be worshiping your phone, worshiping your laptop, worshiping TikTok, or whatever this something might be. You're still, like, in that way, still worshiping something. What do you think about those claims?
Well, it really depends on how you define worshiping, because the idea of what worship is um, differs from different viewpoints. So, for example, some people might consider putting a famous person on a billboard somewhere as a type of worship, rather than, well, some people just consider it advertising and publicity. So it really depends on how you define what worship is. So, of course, I don't want to get into this because this would be hyper controversial and off topic too. But there's the question of what is latria, dulia, and hyperdulia, and is there a meaningful distinction between those? And that's a criticism that some Protestants have of Roman Catholics, but I'm not going to get into that because that would be off topic. But that's another way in which different people can define what worship is and what isn't worship, that is. And that's why I'm making the example. Now, when it concerns religion and the importance of religion in society as for determining, let's say, axiology, what is right and wrong, what people ought to do, that is, in my view, religion is the big difference. And it cannot be understated how big of a difference religion makes in axiology, and through axiology, various types of philosophy going into politics. And this is something that I've understood from experience because I talk to different people from different political ideologies, and I try to get to their axiology, why they think certain actions are right and wrong, why they're justified and unjustified. And ultimately, I find that the difference between political ideologies is ultimately a religious difference. And that realization is, in my view, essential to understand as to why there is sectarian conflict in societies and why it's so difficult to agree on things. Because ultimately, someone who professes to be a Christian, who is in favor of democratic socialism, is going to have to root his religious ideas in a different way than someone who opposes socialism. And therefore the difference is ultimately between ideologies, and not just among people who are explicitly religious people, but also among irreligious people. The metaphysical principles that people hold is central for every single other issue that arises philosophically and politically. And
To
that's why, in my view, it is so difficult to unite a society.
mm-hmm. Do you think, based off of what you said there, do you think that religion gives society like ethics or morals?
I think that on an individual level, people's religion informs their ethics and morals. But I would say that the way those apply to a society is ultimately dependent on who's in power. So it all really depends on power politics. So if someone is in power, that person applies his moral principles on that society. Uh, so it's similar to the legal concept of cuius regio eius religio. Here I reign, therefore my religion, and that is to say, not that the ruler necessarily determines the religion of his subjects, because that's actually very, very difficult to control. It's very hard to forcefully convert people. A lot of people will secretly follow a different religion, or they will form a syncretism between their old beliefs and their new beliefs. And therefore, forceful conversion is actually extremely difficult, and it's extremely difficult to force religious uniformity in a society.
Mm-hmm.
But what that, however, means is that legally speaking, religion, as based on a power holder, will necessarily apply to other people of different religions. And so the question then becomes, are you going to be very open and explicit in the religiosity of the power holder, or is the power holder going to be very restrained in that and attempt to generalize the uh, the legal system, so that while it is still based on his religion necessarily, it becomes uncontroversial and therefore is more amenable to political unity.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a huge debate between various people on various sides, on and not just in Christianity with uh, theonomists and Christian nationalists against people who aren't in favor of those ideas, but there's also in Islam the idea of Sharia law versus people that aren't interested in Sharia law, the idea of a forced religious conformity over having a religious or cultural pluralism within a society.
Right. I was just watching a movie recently. I'm trying to remember the name, and I can put it in the comments if it ever comes to my mind because I don't know if I'll remember it on stream. But anyway, the whole idea of the movie was that this leader was identifying himself as a god and the head of the religion, and the whole movie was basically the concept that the more you try to force something down someone's throat, in this case being religion, the more likely the people are to rebel, and more likely the people are to not believe it. And that was the concept of the movie, really. Uh, and then there's another one that's more talks about cults called Midsummer that also kind of has the same sort of underlying kind of themes to it about religion. And I do think we have to answer this question just for the people that are probably thinking about it now, with the factor of when religion did bad in society, because religious leaders such as the heads of churches or the Vatican or in history weren't always the best at leading their religion. Uh, you had the religious wars, and you had everything. You had the Crusades. You had a lot of religious wars, and in some cases, religious executions. So, how would you address the question of religion leading to bad society or bad issues in society?
Well, that's actually, in my view, a loaded question.
Oh, it is
And
a
the
big
reason
question,
it's
yes. But
and the reason it's a loaded question is because you're assuming those events are bad. And
yeah,
if and based on the definitions that I'm using, if we base our axiology on our metaphysical principles, that is our religion, then it is our religion that determines what we consider good or bad. And so for Christians, what is good or bad is determined by what God has decreed to be good or bad. And therefore, for them, it all depends on God's opinion on that, and his ability to enforce his will on the universe and everything. But that means that for an event to be good or bad, we cannot have an extra religious perspective. That is to say, a perspective that does not take into account metaphysical principles from which an axiology could be derived. Because by doing that, we essentially remove our ability to have an axiology and therefore to have a reason why we can say that things are good or bad. That is to say, that to say that an event is good or bad is to automatically already have presumed a religion. So that is to say, if we say that the Crusades are bad, then we have to say that the Crusades are bad from X religious perspective, and then we can debate within that religion whether the Crusades are bad. But if we say the Crusades are bad in general, but we don't put forward a solid axiology based on a metaphysical concept as to why they are bad, then we don't really have a reason to call them bad. And I'm not making, okay, before people say, I'm not making a pro theism argument by saying that, because I know that this is an argument people do make, uh, because I am saying is that what I am saying is that atheists, for example, do have their metaphysical principle, and when they make an argument as to whether something is good or bad, they have to acknowledge that the goodness or badness of an action is based on their metaphysical principles, which might not be the same as the metaphysical principles that a Christian is using, or that a Muslim is using, or that a Hindu is using, or anyone else. And therefore, to say that a historical event committed by someone for religious reasons is bad necessarily requires us to have a religion to base that on. So that is to say, without putting it into the context of a religion, we can't say that these things are bad.
I get what you're saying there for sure. Uh, I'm trying to think of devil's advocate to play on it, and one thing that kind of came to mind with a modern example would be the general, and we're kind of getting on a slightly different questions here compared to the question we started with, but I do think it relates to the question of going back to like the main theme of religion in society. But anyway, that question being, why does God, and I'm using kind of like in their words that I hear a lot, why does God do bad things such as COVID, or such as, you know, in the past, well, let's just say such as COVID, because it's a modern example.
Yeah. So this is a question that is a very ancient question, and that many people throughout history have given an answer to. And the answers that people gave to the questions of why does God do things that we perceive to be bad, or why does God allow bad things to happen, the answers to these questions are called theodicies, uh, and and there are some very well developed theodicies. The one I prefer is the Augustinian theodicy, wherein the events that are perceived as bad all happen for a greater purpose, and the injustice that exists in the world will all be resolved in the end. And that because there is a greater purpose, there's no such thing as meaningless suffering, because it all occurs ultimately to a greater purpose.
Right. It's kind of like the individualistic, if I said that right, approach to kind of viewing things that happened uh, in a short period of time. I'm not sure if I said that necessarily super well, but the idea being that as humans, we're very focused on the short term, and if you're really good, maybe like a couple days in the future, type of thing. But God's plan, I guess you could call it, is a lot more larger scale than how the human scale works. So, uh,
Yeah.
I mean, I think it would be in a perfect world, even though it's interesting to say that as well. And you could have a debate on that concept. Those wouldn't exist. You know, plagues wouldn't exist. The wars wouldn't exist. You know, these things wouldn't happen. But that's kind of it's kind of the same issue you fall back into with what we just talked about as well.
Yeah, but then the question becomes, what is the perfect world? Um, and you'd have to base that on something, because it's not something that just pops into our minds out of nothing. What a perfect world is, we have to base it on something.
Mm-hmm.
And from once again, my perspective, I would say that the suffering in this world, and the destruction, and the ultimate judgment of evildoers, the existence of evil itself has a constructive purpose, and brings us from the original world that was a good world, a world that was very good, God had said, to a world that is good, but in an even greater way, because of the greater revelation of God's attributes, his justice, his mercy, and things that would be unknown in a world where evil had never occurred. So that's another theodicy in there. But anyway, that's not really the question here.
Right. We got a little bit
because
sidetracked.
because ultimately the question on whether these things are bad or not will depend on your religion, and the Christian perspective is necessarily that God determines what things are good or bad anyway, and therefore to put yourself in a place where you're judging whether God is good or bad is an inversion of the metaphysical principle, um, foundational to the belief system, and therefore is unwarranted internally. But going back onto the question, does society need religion? My answer to that question ultimately is that society is religious and will be religious, and the rulers of society will have a religion that they will implement to some extent legally, and under question of, is it possible for people to operate without metaphysics? My answer is no. People can pretend to operate without metaphysics, but I don't think that's something that really happens. And in that sense, the answer as to does society need religion is once again a question of whether religion is accessory to society or whether society is accessory to religion. And the religious perspective, which precedes the social perspective, necessarily says that society is accessory to religion.
Definitely. I don't know if y'all were hearing the mower, but he decided to mow right now. Anyway, but to answer the question of does society need religion, I would say, in short, yes, society does need religion, and I also think society will lead to religion. So I think the fact that we've seen it in history that it does, and we both think that if the world were to be created now, and we don't have any prior knowledge or history of the past, we would both say that a religion would exist does answer the question as well. And you could argue to why that is, and you brought up the concept of nature, that it's in the human body or in the human brain, that and that's why. And I think that I've heard that claims before as well. But in short, I do think that society does need religion because it gives a good set of values, and it simply is going to exist.
Yes. So I guess my opposition to that would be that I consider values to be accessory to religion rather than religion accessory to values.
Right, yeah, yeah.
But yeah,
That was probably a bad way of saying it, but
yeah. But well, a lot of people are used to thinking in that. Once you really get down to it, the changing the way you think about things is a bit difficult.
right. Definitely, definitely so. Learning is not always easy by any means.
Yeah. But anyway, we're all learning, and that's why we're all interested in getting the answers.
Yes, definitely. I don't know if you had any other questions or what you wanted to say off of this.
No, I think I've pretty much said everything I wanted to say.
Yeah. And I see you there, Seawall. And I think Seawall was talking about like the Big Bang. And I'll just read his comments since we're at the end here. He said, simply, you cannot have light without a cause. So I think that that's also a very interesting idea as well, and is one of the ways that I personally argue religion to atheist friends or whatnot. So I think that that also is kind of a uh, interesting comment that I thought we could that I could give a shout out at the end here.
Ah, but Plato says that light is eternal as a form and therefore does not have a cause. Haha. Gotcha. No,
No,
I'm joking.
no, Seawall's gonna
I'm
voice call you now.
no, I just think it's interesting. But yes, there are religious perspectives that say that things can be eternal and without causes. Uh,
Yeah, there's so many different religious dominations. It's kind of for Christianity at least. It's kind of crazy thinking about it. Alrighty, so I think that'll be the end of today's episode. Thank you once again, audience, for stopping by or watching this at a later point. Next week's episode will be on Anavolta's channel. And also, I'll make sure to say that if you do have topic ideas or something you want us to talk about, definitely you can reach us on Discord or on the YouTube comment section or wherever you found this video, and we might do a future episode on that. But I'll go ahead and let Anavoltes mention anything he wants to mention before we get out of here.
yep. So thank you all for watching, our beautiful audience. It's been great having you, and it's been great putting forward our ideas to you as well. And once again, I do have a book, Actionable Justice. The special edition is available at taurusnecris.com. You can still buy an ebook version on Amazon Kindle. So anyway, thank you all for watching.